In 1972, inside a private gym in Los Angeles, a man who had trained champions stepped into the ring with Bruce Lee. He had agreed to a light sparring session. What happened 15 seconds later was not caught on any official record, but those who were there never forgot it. And decades later, when the footage surfaced, it didn't just confirm the story, it explained why the trainer never spoke about that day again. The gym was not the kind of place where legends were supposed to be made. It sat on a quiet block in West Los Angeles, wedged between a dry cleaner and a photography studio. The sign out front was faded, the windows were high and narrow. Inside, the air smelled like leather and sweat and old wood. It was a working gym, a place where serious people came to train without an audience. On a Thursday afternoon in late summer 1972, a man named Eddie Futch walked through the front door. He was not famous yet, not the way he would be years later, but anyone who knew boxing knew the name. He had worked corners for some of the best fighters in the country. He understood timing, distance, and leverage in ways most men never would. He had been invited by a mutual acquaintance, a stuntman who had worked on a few films and knew people in both circles. The message had been simple. Bruce Lee wanted to meet him. No cameras, no press, just a conversation between professionals. Futch agreed out of curiosity more than anything else. He had seen Lee's movies. He respected the athleticism. But he had also spent his life around men who fought for real under lights, with everything on the line. He wanted to see what this other world looked like up close. When he arrived, the gym was nearly empty. 2 men were working a heavy bag in the corner. Another was skipping rope near the far wall. The stuntman who had arranged the meeting waved him over and led him toward the back, where a smaller training area had been set up with mats, a speed bag, and a makeshift ring, just ropes and posts, no canvas. Bruce Lee was standing near the ring, wrapping his hands. He looked up when Futch approached, and his face opened into a smile that seemed genuine. He was smaller than Futch had expected, lean, compact, but the way he moved, even just turning to shake hands, had a kind of precision to it that Futch recognized immediately. They spoke for a few minutes. Lee asked about Futch's work, about the fighters he had trained, about what he looked for in a student. Futch answered carefully, watching Lee's eyes. There was no arrogance there, no posturing, just focus. At some point the conversation shifted. Lee mentioned that he had been studying Western boxing, that he admired the footwork, the economy of motion. He said he believed that all fighting systems had something to teach, if you were willing to listen. Futch nodded. He appreciated the humility, but then Lee said something that hung in the air a little longer than it should have. "I'd be honored if you'd show me how a real boxer moves," it was said politely, almost deferentially, but Futch felt the weight of it. Not a challenge, not quite, but an invitation to something more than conversation. He glanced at the ring, and without fully understanding why, he heard himself say yes. The gloves were brought out without ceremony. They were standard 16-ounce sparring gloves, worn but clean, the kind used in gyms across the country. Futch laced his own. Lee did the same, moving with the kind of efficiency that suggested he had done this many times before. No one announced what was happening, but the 2 men working the heavy bag had stopped. The man skipping rope had slowed to a walk and drifted closer. A small audience was forming at the edges of the space, quiet and watchful. Futch stepped between the ropes and rolled his shoulders. He was not here to hurt anyone. This was light sparring. A demonstration, maybe. A chance to see how Lee moved under pressure, how much of what he did on screen translated to actual contact. Lee climbed in across from him, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. Futch noticed the stance immediately. It was not traditional. Lee's lead foot was forward, but his weight was distributed in a way that allowed him to shift in any direction without telegraphing. His hands were low. His chin was not tucked the way a boxer's would be. It looked vulnerable. Futch didn't say anything. But in his mind, he was already cataloguing openings. The stuntman who had arranged the meeting stepped forward and asked if they wanted a timer. Lee shook his head. "Just 1 round," he said. "Light contact, no egos." Futch smiled at that. "No egos?" He agreed. But as he settled into his stance, he couldn't help testing the distance with a few short feints, just to see how Lee would react. Lee didn't flinch, didn't step back. He only watched. And then, almost casually, Futch said it. "I've always wondered how movie choreography holds up against real footwork." It wasn't meant to be disrespectful. Not entirely. But there was an edge to it, a small challenge buried in the tone. Lee's expression didn't change. He nodded slowly, as if considering the question seriously. "I guess we'll find out," he said. The stuntman stepped back. Someone clapped twice to signal the start, and Futch moved first. He came in with a measured jab, testing range and reaction time. Lee slipped it easily, shifting just enough to let it pass. Futch followed with another, sharper this time, and Lee parried with an open hand, redirecting it rather than blocking. Futch circled left, keeping his guard tight. He threw a 1-2 combination, nothing heavy, just enough to see how Lee handled pressure. Lee moved backward, but not in retreat. He was resetting, adjusting angles. For the first 10 seconds, Futch felt like he was in control. His footwork was clean. His punches were landing where he wanted them. Gloves, shoulders, nothing damaging but enough to establish dominance. Lee hadn't thrown a single strike yet. He was only watching. And that, Futch would realize later, should have been the warning. Futch pressed forward. He had fought enough rounds to know when a man was stalling. Lee was moving well, no question about that. His footwork was clean. His head movement was sharp, but he wasn't engaging. And in Futch's experience, that meant one of two things. Either the man was afraid, or he was learning. Futch threw another jab, this time committing more weight behind it. Lee slipped it again, but closer this time. Close enough that Futch felt the displacement of air as Lee's head moved past his glove. He followed with a right cross, aiming for the shoulder. Lee didn't block it. He absorbed it, rolled with it, let the force pass through him rather than meeting it head-on. Futch had seen fighters do that before. Good fighters. Men who understood that defense wasn't about hardness. It was about timing. But there was something else happening. Lee wasn't just defending. He was measuring. Every feint Futch threw, every shift in weight, every adjustment of angle, Lee's eyes tracked it all. He didn't look tense. He didn't look worried. He looked calm. And then, without warning, he stopped moving backward. Futch threw another jab. This time, Lee didn't slip. He stepped in, not into the punch, around it. It happened so fast that Futch's mind registered the motion only after his body had already reacted. Lee closed the distance in a single fluid step, his lead foot planting just outside Futch's own, his hips turning as his rear hand came up in a tight arc. It wasn't a punch, it was a touch. Lee's glove pressed lightly against Futch's ribs, just below the guard, and stopped, no force. No follow-through, just placement. Futch froze. He understood immediately what had just happened. If Lee had committed to that strike, if he had put his weight behind it, Futch's ribs would have folded. He had been completely open. His guard had been high, his elbows tight, but Lee had found the gap so quickly that there had been no time to adjust. Lee stepped back. His hands returned to their low, relaxed position. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. He just reset. Futch felt his pulse quicken. He had been touched dozens of times in sparring, hundreds maybe. But this was different. This wasn't a lucky shot. This wasn't someone getting through because of speed or size. This was control. Lee had shown him an opening and then chosen not to exploit it. And that was worse than being hit. Futch circled right, recalibrating. He threw a slower jab this time, just to buy space. Lee didn't even move. He let it fall short. Futch feinted left, then came in with a hook aimed at Lee's temple. Still light, still controlled, but faster than anything he had thrown so far. Lee didn't block it. He stepped inside it. And this time he didn't stop. Lee moved like water finding a crack. Futch's hook was still in motion when Lee slipped beneath it, his body compressing as he drove forward off his back leg. There was no hesitation, no wind-up, just compression and release. Lee's lead hand came up first, not a punch but a frame. It pressed against Futch's extended arm, controlling the limb, stopping it from retracting. At the same time, Lee's rear hand shot forward in a straight line, aimed not at the head or the body, but at the exact point where Futch's weight was shifting. The strike landed just below the sternum, not hard, but perfectly timed. Futch felt his diaphragm contract, his breath caught, his balance, which had been centered and stable a fraction of a second earlier, suddenly wasn't there anymore. Lee didn't stop. His lead foot swept forward, hooking behind Futch's front leg, and his hands, still controlling the arm, pushed and pulled at the same time. Push on the shoulder, pull on the wrist. Futch's body responded before his mind could. His legs gave out, not from pain, not from force, from geometry. He was on the canvas before he understood how he had gotten there. The gym went silent. Futch lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling. His chest was tight, but he could breathe. His head was clear. Nothing hurt, but he couldn't move, not because he was injured, because his body was still trying to process what had just happened. Lee stepped back immediately. He didn't stand over him, didn't celebrate, didn't even look satisfied. He just waited. Futch blinked twice, then slowly pushed himself up onto his elbows. Lee extended a hand. Futch stared at it for a moment, then took it. Lee pulled him to his feet with surprising strength, steadying him as he found his balance again. Futch's legs felt solid beneath him. His breathing was already evening out. He looked at Lee. Lee looked back. Neither man said anything. Futch reached up and began unlacing his gloves, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately. He pulled the first glove off and dropped it to the mat. Then the second. Lee did the same. The others in the gym, 4, maybe 5 people, remained completely still. No one clapped. No one spoke. They had just witnessed something, but none of them were entirely sure what it was. Futch rolled his shoulders and nodded once. Lee nodded back. "Thank you," Lee said quietly. Futch almost laughed. "Thank you," as if Futch had done him a favor. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was nothing to say, no explanation that would make sense, no question that wouldn't sound foolish, so he just nodded again, turned, and stepped out of the ring. He walked to the bench where his jacket was draped, picked it up, and left the gym without looking back. The door closed behind him, and inside the silence remained. No one moved for several seconds. Lee stood in the center of the ring, unwrapping the tape from his hands with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the entire exchange. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look relieved. He looked the same as he had when Futch first walked in. The stuntman who had arranged the meeting finally stepped forward. His face caught somewhere between confusion and awe. He started to say something, but Lee shook his head gently. "It was just sparring," Lee said. The stuntman nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't believe that for a second. One of the men who had been working the heavy bag approached slowly, glancing toward the door where Futch had exited. "Is he okay?" the man asked. Lee nodded. "He's fine." "What did you do?" Lee didn't answer immediately. He finished unwrapping his hands, folded the tape neatly, and set it on the edge of the ring. "I showed him an opening," Lee said finally, "and then I closed it." The man didn't press further. Lee stepped out of the ring and walked toward the back of the gym, where a small office held his street clothes. The others drifted back to their own training, but the energy in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, thicker. What they had just seen didn't fit into any category they understood. It wasn't a knockout. It wasn't domination. It was something quieter, something harder to explain. Near the far wall, a young student named David had been setting up a camera on a tripod earlier that afternoon. He had been filming practice drills, basic footwork, pad work, nothing significant. The camera had been running the entire time. He hadn't thought to turn it off. Now, as he packed the equipment away, he glanced at the small red light still glowing on the side of the camera. He rewound the tape slightly just to check the angle and saw the ring in frame. He saw Futch. He saw Lee. He saw all of it. David looked around. No one was paying attention to him. Lee had already disappeared into the office. The stuntman was talking quietly with one of the other trainers. David ejected the tape, slipped it into his bag, and said nothing. Years passed. Futch went on to train some of the greatest fighters in the history of the sport. Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, Larry Holmes. His name became synonymous with excellence, with discipline, with an understanding of boxing that few could match. But he never spoke about that day in the Los Angeles gym, not in interviews, not in his autobiography, not even to his closest students. When asked once, late in his life, if he had ever sparred with Bruce Lee, he paused for a long time. Then he said, once. And he left it at that. David kept the tape in a cardboard box for nearly 20 years. It sat beneath old training manuals, forgotten photographs, and equipment catalogs in the corner of a storage unit in Pasadena. He had moved 3 times since that afternoon in 1972, and each time, the box came with him. He never watched it again. Not because he had forgotten what was on it, but because he wasn't sure what to do with it. By the early 1990s, Bruce Lee had been gone for nearly 2 decades. His films had become classics. His philosophy had spread across the world. But the stories about what he could actually do, beyond the choreography, beyond the cinema, had begun to fade into myth. People argued about it endlessly. Some said he was the greatest martial artist who ever lived. Others said he was just an actor with good publicity. David didn't argue with either side. He had seen what he had seen. In 1993, while cleaning out the storage unit, he found the box again. He opened it, saw the tape, and after a long moment of hesitation, he decided to have it digitized. He made 3 copies. One he kept, one he sent to a martial arts historian he trusted, and one he mailed, anonymously, to a documentary filmmaker who had been working on a project about Lee's training methods. The footage surfaced 6 months later. It didn't explode across the internet. The internet barely existed yet. But it circulated among serious martial artists, trainers and historians. It was copied, passed from hand to hand, studied frame by frame. What people saw was not what they expected. There was no spinning kick, no dramatic flourish, no movie magic. Just 15 seconds of movement so precise, so economical, that it looked almost boring to the untrained eye. But to those who understood fighting, real fighting, it was something else entirely. Analysts slowed the footage down. They watched Lee's weight shift. They tracked the angle of his hips. They studied the way he controlled Futch's arm, the way he timed the strike, the way he used leverage instead of force, and they realized something. Lee hadn't beaten Futch because he was faster. He hadn't won because he was stronger. He had won because he had removed every unnecessary element from the exchange and left only what was essential. When the footage finally reached the wider public years later, it didn't go viral for the spectacle. It went viral for the control, for the restraint, for the fact that a man who could have hurt someone chose instead to teach. Futch passed away in 2001. In his later years, a few students had asked him directly about the sparring session, about what had really happened that day. He never gave details, but once, near the end, he said something that stuck with the people who heard it. Bruce Lee didn't fight the way other men fought. Futch said quietly. He didn't try to impose his will. He waited until you gave him an opening, and then he reminded you that you had given it to him. He paused. That's not fighting. That's teaching. The footage still exists. It has been uploaded, downloaded, analyzed, and debated thousands of times. But for those who were there that day, the tape was never the point. The point was what happened after. The silence. The lesson. The fact that 15 seconds could change the way a man saw the world. And the realization that mastery was not about proving anything. It was about knowing you didn't have to.